Welcome to Hillcrest Chapel Video. We hope today's message will help you grow.
My name is Tim, and I get to serve on the teaching team here at Hillcrest and count it an honor to unpack Scripture with you all. I really do. And we've been in the series through the story of Jesus as told by Mark. And we've called this series Stronger, how Mark presents Jesus as the stronger one. And now we're getting towards the end of the story that Mark tells us about Jesus. Today, what I'd like to do with you is I'd like to look at the last 24 hours of Jesus' life through this lens of Jesus as the stronger one, and in some ways pulling together what we've talked about over the last 6 or 7 weeks, and how it comes to a culmination in this last 24 hours of Jesus' life. And I just want to be honest, kind of a heads up, it's sobering, it's intense. Mark does not tell a PG story. And so I've felt kind of a heaviness as I've wrestled with this material. And I just want you to, that's the tone. This is how Mark tells it. And just trying to be genuine with the story as he tells it. So that's where we're going. So today I want to start in, if you want to follow along in your Bibles, we're going to begin in Mark chapter 14, verse 32. So if you'd like to follow along, Mark is pretty far to the right in the Bible. It's after Matthew, before Luke. And just to kind of orient us, we are picking up with the story. It's Thursday night in ancient first century Jerusalem. There's a Passover, this religious festival taking place. All these pilgrims are in town. Jesus has just celebrated this Passover meal with his apprentices, his close friends, and now they're leaving the city. They're going outside the city to like a 30-minute walk to a nearby hillside, and we're picking up the story in Mark 14:32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." We have a map here. I want to show this to you. So you see where it says Garden of Gethsemane? You see the green line? It says Garden of Gethsemane up there. You tracking with me? Yeah, so that's where Jesus is. It's outside the brown line around Jerusalem. That's the city wall. So it's outside of the city wall. It'd be across the Kidron Valley. It's on the side of this Mount of Olives hill. And so they're outside the city, and there's this olive grove there. And this particular one is called Gethsemane. And they're at this olive grove. And the hillside, at this festival, there would have been thousands and thousands of Jews from around the world that came to Jerusalem for this festival. So the hillside is probably covered with pilgrims tent camping and ready for Passover. And here's Jesus, and he sees where things are headed. He sees how the religious authorities, the political authorities are working against him. He sees it's headed towards his death. He knows that he knows it's not going to be good. And he's here and he's praying. And you need to understand, like over the Mount of Olives is the Judean wilderness. 15, 20-minute walk up this hill, over the other side, through all these different anonymous faces, and he can just disappear. Whew. Does anybody remember the first teaching we did in the Stronger series, what the theme of it was? Anybody remember that? Temptation. We talked about Jesus, the beginning. Jesus goes out into the wilderness for 40 days, and he is stronger than the greatest things we can be tempted with. And here at the very end of his life, here's a man. And he knows it's going to be deeply painful. His calling, what God desires him to do, will be deeply, deeply painful. And he knows all he has to do is walk away and it won't hurt. And he chooses to stay for the sake of his God and for the sake of those he loves. He is stronger than temptation. Not in some distant sense, but in the sense of he has faced temptation as deep as we can ever face. And he showed himself stronger than it. He chooses to stay after meeting the full force of temptation. And we pick up in verse 44. One of his apprentices, one of his good friends, Judas, shows up with a gang of soldiers. And in verse 44 we read, "Now the betrayer," that's Judas, "had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." And going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Skipping down to verse 50. "And then everyone deserted him and fled." The second message in our series, we talked about Jesus encountering this man with leprosy, and how leprosy was a condition that would cause everyone to avoid you. This was a man who was completely isolated. And we talked about how Jesus reached out and touched him and healed him, how Jesus is stronger than the things that isolate us. And here we come full circle to the end of Jesus' life, and we see him as the one who is betrayed by someone who has walked with him and shared meals with him. And then in his moment of greatest need, his closest friends abandon him. That Jesus is not stronger than isolation, just in the sense that he can pull people out of isolation, but Jesus becomes the completely isolated one. He is alone. He is stronger. He is the one who is stronger than isolation and becomes the isolate. He is stronger than isolation, not in the sense that he's above it, but that he has come beneath it and not been crushed by it. So they arrest him and they take him to this night trial. The religious leaders gather, and in verse 55 we read, "The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin," it's this court of religious leaders, "were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death." This trial goes on, and eventually it comes to a culmination. They were trying to find evidence against him, and eventually Jesus himself says, "I am the Messiah, and one day I will stand in judgment over all. I am the judge." And they react by condemning him, and we read in the second half of verse 64, "They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, 'Prophesy.' And the guards took him and beat him." We talked about this story of Jesus calming the sea. That there's a storm, and he said, "Be silent," and it went completely still. And we talked about how to Mark's hearers, to Mark's readers, they would have understood that the sea was this image of chaos, and that many of Mark's original readers were in a situation of chaos themselves. That they were in Rome in the mid-60s AD, that Nero, the Roman emperor, was actually sending his soldiers out and arresting people in the middle of the night. And in the middle of the night, there were these trials, and people were having to decide, will I be faithful to Jesus at these night trials at the cost of my own life? And in that time, we learn that Jesus is stronger than chaos, but here it comes full circle. The one who is stronger than the chaos of night trials himself is put on trial in the middle of the night. He's not just above it, but he steps in underneath the chaos for the sake of those he comes to rescue. He's arrested, he's condemned. These religious leaders, they need the Roman governor's authority in order to carry out this execution. So early in the morning, they take him to this man, the Roman leader by the name of Pilate. We pick up in verse 15. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders the teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. It says they bound Jesus. The word there implies this chaining up. Anybody know who else we've read this same word, this binding word? Who else was bound up in chains in the book of Mark? The man filled with demons, right? Legion. They tried to bind him with chains. And Christian shared about how in that account we see that Jesus is stronger than the things that enslave us. Stronger than the things that bind us up. And here we see the one who is stronger than the things that enslave us, the thing that's stronger than the things that bind us up, literally is the one who is bound by chains himself. He's not only stronger in the sense that he can pull people out of enslavement, but he comes and is under, he experiences it himself. He becomes the enslaved one. Pilate makes the decision to crucify Jesus and says that he ordered Jesus flogged. Mark doesn't sensationalize it. He just says, and Pilate ordered him flogged. And any of Mark's first century readers or hearers, they would have known exactly what that meant. And what it meant was that a couple soldiers would have taken Jesus. They had whips. I think we have an image of one. Whips that would have been bone or rock tied into it. And they would have disrobed Jesus and tied him to a pole. And then two soldiers each would have had one of these, and they would have taken turns flogging Jesus as long as they wanted. And these weren't whips that left welts. These were weapons that left open wounds. After a person was flogged, they would have carried a cross. They carried the cross, but not the entire cross. At the execution site, there would have been an upright pole, and then the crossbeam called the patibulum. The victim, the one being killed, would have carried that patibulum to the place of execution. And so Jesus, he's flogged. Then there's this scene where the soldiers mock Jesus, and then he's asked to carry this crossbeam, this patibulum, to the execution site. And so we pick up in verse 21. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. He had to carry it for Jesus. And we talked about this. Why is Simon's first name and his children's names put in there? It's like footnoting, right? This is, if you want to know the firsthand account of this, go talk to Simon. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. It was a painkiller. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. So just so we know what's happening here, here's a map. And if you follow along, there's the top wall there. I drew a red line over it. You see the one I'm talking about? That one wouldn't have been there in Jesus' day. That was built after Jesus' time. So ignore that wall. And then you see where Golgotha is circled there? Can you tell how Golgotha, it's right outside the existing city wall at the time. Can you see? And this is the tradition. This is probably the most likely site for Golgotha, but it's right outside the city wall. In fact, there would have been city gates right there. I mean, this is right on the highway leading away from the mall, right? The on-ramp right outside the busiest downtown section, right where everybody would see this happening. It's this very public place. They take him Golgotha. It's named the place of the skull, probably because it's this place where executions are carried out. And it says that they divide up his clothes, and then they roll dice to see who gets his clothes. These would have literally been the last remaining possessions of Jesus being raffled off. A couple weeks ago, we talked about this account of this rich young man running up to Jesus and saying, "What do I need to do to find eternal life?" And Jesus says to him, you need to be willing to hold everything more loosely than your allegiance to me, to God, and his kingdom. That we told the story, we said that Jesus is stronger than riches. Jesus is stronger than the most important things in our life. And we talked about how Jesus is stronger than riches, and here the one who is stronger than riches literally has his final possessions raffled off, taken away, for the sake of his commitment to his God and his commitment to those he would rescue. So his clothes are raffled off, and then it says they crucified him. And just so we understand what this means, they would have put nails through Jesus' wrists to this crossbeam. They would have hoisted him up and connected it to the upright. They would have put nails through his ankles. And when we hear crucifixion, it's a physically brutal way of killing someone. And it's not like there was some Roman manual on crucifixion, like step 1, step 2, you need to follow these steps. That wasn't the idea of how they went at it. The idea simply was that they would take soldiers, and the soldiers who were violent, who enjoyed hurting people, and they would take these soldiers who enjoyed hurting people, and they'd say, "You're in charge of doing the killing here. Do it in ways that terrify the locals into submission to us. Be as creative as you need to be." It's physically brutal, but it's not only physically brutal. It's meant to be emotionally, social. It's meant to be humiliating. When the victim's clothes are taken away, what are they wearing at that point? Nothing. They're hung up naked right outside, right on the highway entrance, right outside the edge of town. I mean, this isn't way out in the country. This is right where everyone lives, and all these pilgrims are in town. And this is if this happened today, if someone in power paraded someone around naked to humiliate them, like, what would we call that? And this is an honor-shame society. To be shamed, to be publicly shamed, is one of the worst things that can happen to a person. And this is intended to publicly shame someone as much as possible. I mean, have you ever been embarrassed? Have you ever been humiliated? This is the intent, to humiliate the person. It's physical, it's humiliating, and there's even this spiritual component to it. That the Jews in Jesus' day, they lived their life by the Torah, the law of Moses. And the religious leaders would have known, and Jesus and all his followers and the crowds would have known, that in the Torah, in Deuteronomy 21:23, it reads this. It says, "Anyone who is hung on a tree," some translations say a pole, "is under God's curse." They would understand to be crucified, to be hung on a cross, is to be considered cursed by God. Then the religious leaders would have wanted Jesus, his followers, and the crowds to know this man is cursed by God. It's physical, it's humiliating, it was spiritual. They hang a sign of the crime committed above his head. It read, "The King of the Jews." And then we pick up in verse 31. "In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. 'He saved others,' they said, 'but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross. that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Last week we talked about Jesus as stronger than blindness about his way. We said that in some ways you could say ultimately there are two ways of being in this world. There's the way of Jesus, the way of the cross, the way of sacrificial love, and there is the way of power for self. These are ultimately the two ways of being in this world. And we said that Jesus is stronger than blindness about his way, that he can even people who are blind, that he can pull them to show them his way of being in this world. But here, he's not stronger than blindness about his way from a distance, but ultimately the blindness about his way, the way of power for self, the end game of power for self is the mocking and killing of an innocent and good man. And he takes on all the consequences. He takes on the end game of spiritual blindness, and he goes underneath it. The one who is stronger than blindness about his way becomes the victim to blindness about his way. And then in verse 33, at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And then verse 37, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." And here we come to this a surprising statement by this Roman soldier after Jesus' death. He says, surely this man was the Son of God. And this statement, we shouldn't take it to mean that all of a sudden this Roman soldier had a full-orbed theological understanding of who the second person of the Trinity was. That's not, but he's saying there is something in this soldier has seen death over and over and over again. And something about the way this man experienced death was different. Surely there's divinity, there's deity, there's something divine about this one. It is different. And this is critical to understand. That Jesus, do not think of Jesus as this passive victim who got swept up in events larger than him, who's just passively defeated at the end. This is an active choice to allow this to take place. Even his silence, even the way he goes through these final moments of life is an active choice not to respond in kind to all the hate brought at him. He is not, as we've gone through the book of Mark, we have seen this one is the stronger one. Jesus is a man of incredible force of character. And the same man that we're reading about being killed here, it's the same one who fasted 40 days and refused all temptation brought to him. It's the same one who, when everyone was running away from the leper, walked and reached and put his hand on the leper to heal him. It's the same one that when a crazed, demon-possessed man ran at him, he did not flinch. I mean, we have seen the strength of character who stood up when the fishermen were afraid of the storm. He stood up in the boat and said, "Be quiet." Who when the wealthy elite came up to him and said, "Jesus, can you do this for me?" He wasn't intimidated. This is the same one when the crowd was pushed up against him and shouting and told the beggar to be quiet. He stopped the whole parade just to chat with the blind beggar. We have seen this is a man of incredible force of character, of deep strength. And so when we come to these final moments of his life, do not see him as this weak, passive. This is a man who is actively allowing this to happen and actively choosing not to respond in kind. Jesus is stronger than the worst humanity could bring against him. He's stronger than it. The Roman Empire is the pinnacle of human political and military might at the time, brought down with force upon Jesus. We see in Judaism at the time the pinnacle of what religion could be and all its hypocritical force brought down upon Jesus. We see mocking, we see violence, and we see in this man the same strong, good man that we've seen throughout the whole story. And there's this sense that and behind all this spiritual evil behind pushing these things along, and there's this sense that if all this hate could be brought against Jesus and he does not respond in hate, if betrayal could be brought against Jesus and he does not betray his calling, if evil could be brought against Jesus and he does not himself turn evil, if all this violence and hate and mock could be brought against him, but through it all he does not become the evil or the hate or the vindictiveness that's brought against, if he remains the same unrelentingly good man he has always been, in this way he is stronger than the worst humanity can bring against him. You know, a lot of times when we talk about the cross, and we'll talk about in kind of the, maybe you might say, the mechanics of forgiveness, how the exchange of forgiveness works. And later writers in the New Testament, they reflect on how does this work and how, you know, how does this forgiveness thing work? But Mark, as he's telling this story, he's not doing this theological kind of abstract reflection in that way. He's simply telling the story of the God-man who is stronger than the worst humanity could bring against him. That he faced the worst, and at the end of it, people said, surely this one has divinity in him. He could take the hate and take the evil and not respond in kind. And so I think I'd say it this way, that if Jesus is stronger than the worst humanity can do, the worst evil can bring against a person, Jesus, if he is stronger than the worst humanity can do, then that means he is stronger than our worst today. Jesus is stronger than the worst things you might face. That he was not turned into the hate or the revenge or the betrayal, the evil he faced, but he remained wholly good and wholly strong through it all. Underneath it, he was not crushed by it. And that means whatever you're facing, he is stronger than that. And he can be the stronger one for you in that. Not that we do it on our own, but he says, will you let me be the stronger one for you? If he is stronger than the worst that humanity can do, he is stronger than our worst. That means not only that, he is stronger than the worst within us. You know, the word within me, like those hidden thoughts, those things that I want to say, those things that I should have done and I didn't do. I know my worst. We all know our worst. None of us ever fully lets another in on the darkness that we see within ourselves. And Jesus says that he's stronger than my worst. He's stronger than your worst. That he can see what's within you, and he will not respond with hate, with abandonment, with revenge, with betrayal. Here is one who can take the worst humanity can give and absorb it and respond with goodness and kind. That he's stronger than our worst. And I think Mark tells a story the way he does, that Jesus is the stronger one, and he brings us to a point of decision. Throughout the entire story of Jesus, we find in the story of Jesus, Jesus over and over again, when he encounters people, he becomes a fork in the road for them. Every time Jesus meets someone, they have to decide how are they going to respond to this Jesus? Will they follow? Will they trust? Will they listen? Will they turn away? Will they reject? Will they condemn? That Jesus, over and over again, every person, he is a fork in the road. And I think here, in the culmination of his story, he is the fork in the road. He is the ultimate fork in the road. The question of, will you let Jesus be the stronger one for you? This is the question of history. This is the pivot point on which human history turns. There's no question that we can get behind or underneath. Will you let this stronger one that we have learned about through the Gospel of Mark, who is present today by his Spirit, will you let him be the stronger one for you? The things that threaten to crush you, will you let him be the stronger one? The worst you see within yourself, will you let him be the stronger one? This is the question we're left with. And so I simply want to announce this good news to us today. And I know it's sobering and I know it's an intense story, but it is, friends, it is good news. It's good news. It's good news. It's good news that in a world where every day we see betrayal and abandonment and rejection and isolation and the lure of riches and wealth and power and the desire to hate back and the desire to insult back and the desire to mock back. We see this, we see it outside of us, we see it within ourselves. And here we come to one who is wholly, 100% completely stronger than it all. Not from a distance, throwing lightning bolts, blowing it up, but one who has gone under it, in it, through it, and was not defeated by it. And he says, will you let me be the stronger one for you? Let's pray. Abba, Father, you who sent your Son out of love for your world, Jesus Messiah, you who are stronger for us in all that we could bring against you. Spirit of life, you who call us out of darkness and make us new. As we announce your good news this morning, the good news of your strength, even in the face of darkness and evil, may we hear it that way, Jesus, as a call to decision of what will be the access point that our life turns around. You invite us to trust you, to cast ourselves upon you as our personal stronger one. Whatever we're going through this morning, may we know that you see it, you do not minimize it, you see us completely, even more fully than we see ourselves, and you desire to be our stronger one. May we hear your invitation today anew. Amen.
Thanks for connecting with Hillcrest Chapel. For more info on this and other sermons, go online to hillcrestchapel.com or visit us at 1400 Larrabee Ave in Bellingham, Washington, any Sunday morning, 9 or 11 a.m.